Chapter 36, Wings Over Kitty Hawk. In some ways, Eddie's dad was still a kid at heart, like the time he came out to go sledding with the boys. It was while they were living at the house beside the big pasture called the Bull Field. A deep snow had fallen, and the whole neighborhood had come out with sleds, toboggans, metal trays, and shovels to go sledding. They gathered at the top of a large bowl-shaped valley, and one after another pushed off the edge. The kids would pick up speed as they raced down the hill, snow flying out behind them. By the time they got to the bottom of the long hill, they looked like tiny dots. Some of the bigger boys had constructed a ramp halfway down the hill, and the braver ones were risking their necks, sailing over it, competing to see who could cover the greatest distance in the air. They put an old scarf in the snow to mark the record. Now, when Eddie's dad showed up, he surveyed the scene, his eyes lighting on the jump. As Eddie came panting up the hill with the small, flexible flyer sled, his dad reached for it with a gleam in his eye. "Dad?" Eddie asked with concern. "What are you going to do?" "Why, I'm going to break the record over the jump." Dad?" Eddie hesitated, looking from the small sled to his dad's belly. "Are you sure? That's a pretty big jump." "Just watch," said his dad as he situated himself on the little sled and pushed off. Eddie was about to get a practical lesson in elementary physics. Because his dad weighed more than the other kids, the sled picked up more speed. By the time he hit the jump, Eddie calculated he must have been doing around 65 miles per hour. He sailed off the end of the ramp with a whoop, and he kept on sailing. 10, 20, 30 feet it looked like. The scarf was far behind him when he landed. Now, landed may not have been exactly the right word. When the runners touched down, the weight of the impact drove them straight through the snow, down to the dirt. The sled stopped dead in its tracks, and the runners folded underneath with a screech. Eddie's dad lay spread eagle on the snow, not moving. By the time the boys ran down the hill, he'd managed to roll off what was left of the sled and was just recovering his breath. He picked snow out of his ears, nose, and eyes, and slowly rose to his feet. He didn't have anything to say until that evening, when he took off his shirt. There, in every detail, was a bruise that perfectly matched the wooden deck of the sled. "Does it hurt, Dad?" asked Eddie. "A little," admitted his dad. "But we sure broke that record, didn't we?" Eddie nodded. He wasn't going to say anything, but he was thinking the record wasn't the only thing broken. While Eddie was at Exeter, an article came out in National Geographic. "Happy Birthday, Otto Lilienthal." It was about the world's first hang gliding championships. It was a short article full of pictures of daredevils hanging under rickety bamboo frames covered with polyethylene sheets of black plastic. They were racing down hillsides until they gained enough speed to lift off the ground. They sailed along California cliff tops under brilliant blue skies. Their motto was, to fly no higher than they feared to fall. As Eddie studied the photos, his heart began to race. He'd always wanted to fly. He thought of the ads for the foal boat and the resulting mudcat he'd built in the back room. Surely a hang glider couldn't be any harder to build. But just to be on the safe side, Eddie put $15 in an envelope and sent off for a set of instructions. When he got home for summer, he was ready. The first challenge was locating a source for long pieces of dry bamboo. In the end, a carpet store in Charleston provided what was needed, as the carpets came rolled up on bamboo. He also picked up a couple of rolls of double-sided carpet tape. Then he had to go to a building supply store for a big roll of 6 mil black polyethylene plastic. When everything was assembled, Eddie and the boys began to ponder where to fly their creation. Their hilltop home was fine for takeoffs, but there was no place to land. They'd learned a thing or two from their rat fishing experience about the importance of thorough planning. The boys' dad came to the rescue by suggesting the family take its annual vacation to the Kill Devil Hills of Kitty Hawk, where some other famous brothers invented heavier-than-air flight. The boys responded enthusiastically. So it was that just a few weeks later the family set out in the old red and white Volkswagen microbus, complete with hang glider lashed to the roof. They rolled down the West Virginia Turnpike, through tunnels into Virginia and down Fancy Gap Mountain to the North Carolina Piedmont. Somewhere along the way the engine blew up. Black clouds of smoke billowed from the back of the van, and the boys were torn between the excitement of looking like the Batmobile and anxiety over their delay in reaching the beach. When they finally got to Kitty Hawk, they fought through clouds of mosquitoes to set up their tent. Woe be unto the one that left the door unzippered. Then they set about assembling their flying machine. The long bamboo poles were laid out in a triangular shape, the famous delta wing designed by a man named Rogallo. Then they began to fashion a bamboo truss that supported the wing struts. A pair of shorter poles was attached to the truss from which the pilot would hang, swinging his legs and positioning his weight to control the glider. The bamboo pieces were lashed together and the black plastic unrolled. Using two-sided carpet tape, the boys rolled the black plastic onto the leading edges of the wing. They stood back to admire their work, looking like cavemen gloating over the carcass of a pterodactyl they'd downed. Not far from their campsite was a likely-looking dune. It was not too tall, and it faced a stiff wind coming in off the sea. Together, they wrangled their contraption to the top of the hill and turned it to face the wind. While his brothers held the ends of the wings, Eddie jockeyed himself into the cockpit, hoisting the bamboo poles up under his armpits. On the count of 3, they all began running down the dune into the wind. Eddie heard the deafening flap of the plastic overhead and felt the bars lifting him off the ground. He remembered the hang glider's motto, "Don't fly higher than you care to fall." Fortunately, on his maiden voyage, he only lifted 3 feet off the ground, a height with which he felt completely comfortable. The bird sailed about 20 feet before it touched down. The boys were ecstatic. Scotty took his turn, then Jimmy. Greg and Gray were allowed to go, but their big brothers held the ends of the wings. They were having a wonderful time. And then their dad walked over. He had a gleam in his eye and an excited smile on his face. "Hey, boys," he said, "can I have a go? What do you say?" Well, after all, he'd been the one to bring them all the way to the beach just to fly the thing. Sure, Dad, but be careful," Eddie said. He couldn't help but think of the flexible flyer. "I've got this," said his dad confidently, and hoisted the glider off the ground. Slowly he began to pick up speed. The boys ran alongside, stabilizing the wings. The glider began to gain altitude, but something was wrong. The nose lifted into the air, and a puff of wind caught the glider under the right side. That wing rose high into the air, and the whole contraption began a slow death roll. In seconds, the nose was headed earthward. A moment later, and there was a sickening crash. The boys raced to where their father was extracting himself from the wreckage. "Don't worry about me, boys," he yelled over the gusty wind. "I'm fine." As the boys stared down at the crumpled frame and splintered bamboo of their glider, they didn't have the heart to tell their dad it wasn't really him they were worried about.